that India-China relations are not good. That doesn't mean we can ignore China. China is the second largest economy. Our trade with them is growing. And on climate change, on regional security, we'll have to keep talking to them. But quite clearly, I think the change or the trick for us is not to be carried away by any one of the formats.
After a long time, we're starting the videos up again. I hope people have missed us and I hope you're watching now. So this week in your column in Raja Mandala, it's an interesting point you make is about how the G20 is the peg, as we call it in the news business, the G20 meeting and the finance ministers gathering couldn't come up with a joint statement. And that's possibly because or likely because of the kind of great power conflicts, China, US, Russia, of course, US, Russia, Ukraine, all of it, and it's what they're calling the new Cold War. And that's affecting these post-Soviet Union era multilateral institutions. My first question, which covered in the column, but I'd like you to expand on it, and everyone should read the column. It's on the indianexpress.com and probably in the description of this video. What sort of, you say tempering expectations, because domestically and from the government, you have this India's presidency of G20 is going to change the world kind of thing, and all these slogans. That what realistically is something that we should be looking at, or the government should be looking at from this presidency of the G20?
No, I think the greatest achievement for India will be if you prevent the current conflict between the major powers from doing more damage to multilateralism. At this point, it's quite clear things are getting worse. They'll get a lot more worse before they get any better, because we see the battle lines being drawn between Russia and China on one side and the US and Europe on the other, and other allies joining up with the US. So I think we are at a difficult moment for multilateralism. While for India, this is a major opportunity, a diplomatic opportunity to engage the world's top 20 economies, we should also be realistic that this is not a great moment for multilateralism, because unlike in the previous 25 years, after 1991, where all the sides were ready to work with the other, today they're in deep political conflict, military conflict, and economic conflict. So therefore, I think we should be realistic. My sense is the diplomacy is realistic, whatever the public hoopla might be about it. But my sense is that's the reason why both in Bali, where India was taking over the chair, and the last few days, Delhi is trying to keep the process going, make sure that at least in the statement of the chairman's summary that it has issued, that it keeps all interests represented there. So I think it's a managing the tension between great power conflict and the multilateralism. I think that is the burden. And I think that burden, as long as we can carry that without too much damage to the system, that will be an accomplishment.
One can't help but draw an analogy between this burden of multilateralism in the G20 presidency, as well as what we've been calling the balancing act since the Ukraine conflict broke out, which was, you have certain deep ties with Russia, you have to do business with China in some form or the other. It's too big to completely ignore, while you have now growing cooperation with the West, plus a sort of this freedom versus unfreedom, kind of the Cold War kind of dichotomy or camps that are being created. How do you see these tensions vis-a-vis multilateralism, India's multilateralism being managed?
No, I think the key, I think, is the judgment of what format do you use for what purpose. Because one of the things we are saying in this article is that there are multiple forms of multilateralism. It is not just one. In the past, India used to say, look, in the talking about the UN or the non-aligned movement, that's all the multilateralism we used to do. But today, I think we are in multiple groups. We sit in the BRICS. We also sit in the Quad. We are in the, for example, in the G20, but we also attend the G7 meetings, which is a club of the developed countries. So I wouldn't say this is a balancing act, but I think our interests need to be pursued in whatever form we can. Because UN is not going to produce too many results. G20 is not going to produce results. But if we can be part of the G7 groups attempt to develop new rules for the international system, we should engage with it. If we can use the BRICS at least to meet some of our interest, we should pursue that. And underlying all this, of course, is the other aspect that India-China relations are not good. That doesn't mean we can ignore China. China is the second largest economy. Our trade with them is growing. And on climate change, on regional security, we'll have to keep talking to them. But quite clearly, I think the change or the trick for us is not to be carried away by any one of the formats. To be able to do two different responsibilities. One, secure our own interests. Other is to produce some collective public goods for the international system. That would demand we work with even countries we see as adversaries like China. And at the same time, we also have problems with China. Therefore, how do we pursue our interests? Both have to be done. I mean, that is the challenge today. And I think that's what we're going to be tested. And if we come through this reasonably well, that I think should be a great learning experience for India.
One final question, or perhaps second last, is, you mentioned something very interesting, is that in the post-Soviet era, in the post-Cold War era, all these from the WTO to things like G7, G20 after the 2008 crisis, there was an assumption that since the ideological war on basic systems, that these international rules of the game, which sort of if all the great powers basically agree to play by the same set of rules, and now those rules themselves are under challenge from China in certain respects, from Russia and others. Vis-a-vis Taiwan, that has died down a bit, but that's still a very real possibility. How do you see that in a sort of larger sense playing out? Because, like, for example, what some countries calls, the Global Times China kind of publication, you can see rules-based order, they read as Western hegemony. I mean, there's almost, so that kind of fundamental difference of, if you don't have that basic understanding to move forward in a global sphere, how do you negotiate that kind of world? A lot of us, the younger lot, don't remember the Cold War era at all.
No, I think if you look at Chinese propaganda, I mean, they talk as if it's all Western rules.
Yeah.
But who's violated the rules in April 2020 in Galwan?
Yeah.
For 30 years, we had agreements with China saying they don't bring large number of forces to the border. But that's precisely what they did. So I think Chinese are very self-righteous. It's always the other side's fault. They're always nice. But it's not just India's experience vis-a-vis China. Look at South China Sea, where they have unilaterally taken territories. The only difference between Russia and China is Russia tried to do too much in one shot, tried to take the whole country. What Chinese are smarter, they're doing one slice at a time. They've taken bits and pieces of South China Sea. Even last week, Malaysia is a friendly country of theirs, but the ships are operating without permission in Malaysia's coastal waters. So I think there is a certain arrogance which the Chinese bring. So when they criticize the West, I don't think India is impressed with that, because we are at the receiving end of the Chinese violation of rules. Yeah. So is Japan, so is the Vietnam, so is the large number of countries. So that is as far as Chinese propaganda is concerned. And I think after the end of the Cold War, that is the main question you asked. It didn't matter if China was communist and America was capitalist, but they could do booming trade. I mean, it's now close to almost $800 billion bilateral trade between US and China. So you had a phase where ideological differences did not matter. Everyone was getting along with everyone else. There was no military conflict. For example, Russia-Germany trade was deep. But I think what's happened in the last 2 years is, one, as we said, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the Chinese aggression in Asia have changed the mood on this question. Second, the Chinese leveraging of their economic position for unilateral gains. That has put off a number of countries, including India, US, a whole lot of other countries. So they're trying to redraw the system under which we work with trade with each other. So I think we're in a new phase. So drawing new rules is important. And that can only come if we all work together. But assuming we can't work together, that is the reality today. How do we keep the multilateral system going without further collapsing? Meanwhile, work with like-minded countries to produce at least some rules which we can start implementing and generate support for them regionally. For example, nobody should take another country's territory by use of force. Yeah. That's probably the simplest rule in international politics. But I think that's a rule we should at least reaffirm and agree on.
Great. Sir. Thanks so much. We will be back next week now. I hope everyone's watching again. The article is on the indianexpress.com. You should go there, have a look at it. And thank you so much, sir. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Akash. Glad to be back with you.